Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 3 of our very special series for Cell and Gene, the podcast called FDA Fridays. For this episode, I had the pleasure of speaking to one of the brightest minds in our space, Bambi Grilley, Ph.D. She's the professor of pediatrics and the director of clinical research and early product development for the Center of Cell and Gene Therapy at Baylor College of Medicine, and she's the chief regulatory officer for ISCT. Dr. Grilley is a friend of Cell and Gene, and she's a leading expert in pediatric cell and gene therapy, and she brings a wealth of clinical insight and real-world perspective to our conversation, which you'll hear in just a second. She discusses the multifaceted barriers that prevent children and families from accessing innovative treatments, and you'll hear her share details around the highly specialized expertise required for manufacturing and delivery to the logistical, financial, and emotional burdens placed on families, especially those in rural or underserved areas. She and I explore regulatory hurdles unique to pediatric indications, including delayed approvals and insufficient trial data. And she shares powerful examples of treatments that work but remain stuck in perpetual limbo, unable to reach the children who need them most. So this is a really important and informative episode, just as all 3 to date have been. The 4th, featuring Daniela Drago, is coming up. Episode 1 features my conversation with Dr. Kay Spratt, and episode 2 features my conversation with Monica Svetlika. Please do yourself a favor and tune into all 3. And then, of course, Danielle is coming up for episode 4. You will truly feel that it is time well spent. These are great conversations with experts in the space. So thanks for your time and attention during FDA Fridays. And for now, here is my conversation with Dr. Bambi Grilley. Enjoy. Bambi, thanks for joining me on Cell and Gene, the podcast, for this special FDA Friday series. You're one of our best friends here at Cell and Gene, and so I'm really happy to have you back on the podcast and ready to hear all the great information you're going to share with us.
Glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. So first, I want to talk a little bit about access and equity. So from your perspective and based on your expertise, what are the most pressing barriers, would you say, preventing patients, especially the pediatric population, from accessing cell and gene therapies once they've been developed?
So I think that this is very multifactorial. I think that part of this is global to the field, and part of this really does dig in very specifically to pediatric patients. But I want to start with kind of the high level thing, which is the expertise that's required for the manufacture and delivery of these products. Making it such that this isn't a product you can pick up at your Walgreens and take home with you and take in your house. This isn't a product that you can even go to your local hospital and receive in our current environment. This is a product that requires very specific manufacturing, usually by extremely professional experts in the field. And related, it requires very expert delivery. And so we're talking about patients, especially patients in rural areas, underserved communities, even states that don't have big academic medical centers. They have to travel to receive these treatments. And that's a big burden on people. This is not entirely related, but it's similar, which is the UK was one of the early adapters of CAR T cells. They jumped in with both feet. They approved these products. They have a publication that from 16 approved CAR T cell centers, they think that 35% of the patient population has even talked to their providers about receiving those treatments. That's a low acceptance rate of a potentially curative therapy, right?
Right.
And the reason that most of the patients gave for why they did not want to receive these products was related to logistics. So let's say, and this is a big say, that your insurance company would pay for your product. They agree that they will pay what is in the U.S. between $275,000 and $4 million for you to receive this product, not counting, if you get any kind of adverse effect, something happens and you're required to be hospitalized or in the ICU, God forbid. None of that is included in the costs I just mentioned. But let's just say that they've agreed that they're going to pay for this. And let's use the U.S. as the example here, right? So even in Texas, if you live in West Texas, there's not major academic medical centers in West Texas. You're going to be coming to Austin. You're going to be coming to Dallas. You're going to be coming to Houston. That is a long way. It's a big trip.
Sure.
And especially in the pediatric world, what you see is a lot of people who have a child with a devastating disorder also have other children. So you're basically taking your family vacation to go someplace to stay in a hotel while your child is receiving care. And meanwhile, it's not like a vacation. You don't schedule it for June because that's convenient. It's happening while your children are trying to go to school. So there's the issue of who pays for the hotel, who pays for the airfare. And let's not even kind of get into the specifics of the fact that if your child is critically ill, the travel with them is extremely complicated. If they're in a wheelchair, if they require any kind of tube feedings, if, God forbid, they're on a ventilator or receiving oxygen, all of these things are so hard to travel with those. And so this whole process is so daunting for families. And then there's the issue of they leave their family behind. And again, not to be too pessimistic, but if your child has a bad outcome and they're in Houston, Texas, and their family, including their grandma and their grandpa and your friends and family, are all back in West Texas, sure, your husband's going to fly out. He's going to bring the other kids. Everybody will be there. But if your child dies in another city, you can't ever get over the fact that your safety net wasn't there. Their safety net wasn't there. All of the things they count on in their life aren't there. So that's a big thing that deters patients who know the issues from receiving these types of treatments. Behind that is the fact that our healthcare system really isn't set up to accommodate this. So when the gene therapy for sickle cell disease, when those were approved late last year, Children's National published that they could probably treat 10 gene therapy patients a year. 10. There's 10,000 sickle cell patients. So, we're talking about such a small percentage that they could take on. And that's going to be true at every academic medical center. And that compounded by the fact that they didn't say 10 sickle cell patients. They didn't say 10 of these types, right? So you start taking that across the fact that as we get more and more approvals for more and more indications, if you still have the same number that can get treated, the number that can get treated per disease keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And the last thing that I really want to push on is, in fact, the cost, because the cost is significant. And there hasn't been a huge uptick in insurance companies saying, yes, we will pay these amounts for these potentially curative therapies, because there's so many issues around that, as far as the amount of money they put into it and what they might get back, especially in a world such as ours, where insurance companies cover you based on where you're employed, right? So if an insurance company pays $4 million for my child to get gene therapy, but then I leave this company 2 years from now, I leave this company and I go to some other company and some other insurance, then that's money that they don't actually see the benefit of having had that curative treatment. And I think that really at the bottom line, insurance companies are businesses and they look at it that way. And it is a big thing. And I know I'm taking a long time on this question, but these issues will keep coming back up.
Sure. Absolutely.
There's the fact that in addition to, how many products can you manufacture? How many of these high acuity patients can a hospital take on? There's the incredible administrative burden that an institution takes on, and the gap of money. So when you agree as a hospital that you are going to treat a patient with one of these products, you pay, right? The hospital pays, and then they get reimbursed by the insurance company. Well, that's probably fine-ish when it's like $100 antibiotic or $1,000 chemotherapy. But when you talk about a $4 million product, holding the basket there, holding the $4 million and hoping the insurance will actually pay, that's a huge risk the institution takes on. And you can see where they can't say, oh, let's just do this. Let's get 400 million in the hole here, right?
Right.
So these issues become really large and play really large in our field. And I think it's really one of the reasons that there hasn't been a huge acceptance and uptick in the use of cell and gene therapy products overall, but it definitely plays out large in the pediatric world.
For sure. And really thank you for that background, because I think it's, certainly the cost of the therapy, but all of the extras that are, added on to that, impacting family and caregivers that I don't think everyone always considers or thinks about. And certainly not the least of which is the family with, a child suffering from a disease. So appreciate all that background information. Now, we know that these products have promise in children, but, as you've explained, one, there are very few approved, certainly for pediatric use. From a regulatory perspective, talk to us a little bit about the hurdles that are most responsible for any sort of gap in the regulatory landscape as they apply to pediatric use.
Yeah, so I think that the biggest gap or the biggest hurdle is that frequently the FDA will push on a study on a product being shown to be safe and effective in adults before you can go back and prove that it's safe and effective in children. So I think those of us in the field push pretty hard on this. And frequently when we're working on a product that we think will benefit children, we'll push on, if we prove that a dose level is safe in adults, can we enroll the next patients at that dose level and they be pediatric? Depending on the risk profile of the product, the FDA has been agreeable to that sometimes, but that is something that slows us down. And if you just kind of project that into the future a little bit, you can picture that if an academic institution has done a complete phase 1 study with all adult patients, and the number of patients who could potentially receive the product is going to be primarily adult, the incentive even in an academic institution to go back to do the PD study goes way down, right? It's like the product works, let's move it forward, let's get it out there, let's start the phase 2, let's try to get approval. And definitely investors and things are really all about that, right? Like, where's the product? What data do you have? And so it becomes a little bit of a negative paradigm because you don't have the pediatric data. So then there's decreased interest in the pediatric data, and these products move forward. But I don't actually think that that's the biggest thing. The second thing that could happen is fear of a child dying and how that would impact adult indications. Now, that's not going to be as much of a fear in an academic institution, although I will tell you that, I work at Baylor, I work in the Center for Cell and Gene Therapy. The last thing we want is to be front page news for, Center for Cell and Gene Therapy kills a 5-year-old.
Right.
That is no good.
Sure.
So that is something that all of us do think about when we treat these children, especially if we pushed really hard to get the treatment to this child. But I have 2 stories about this that I think kind of illustrate the issues that we face. And the first one is the Don Cohen ADA SCID story. Mm-hmm. So I'm sure you and your listeners know that SCID is a fatal disorder, an immunodeficiency. Don Cohen and his team developed a treatment for this that they treated 70 children. They had a 100% response rate, and 96% of those children remain basically free of their disease without further treatment, right? Wow. So that cure rate, that is where we in the lay public at least would say it's a miracle, right? Like, this is a fatal disease. So 2015, they hand off the IP to a company called Orchard Therapeutics. Orchard Therapeutics never treats a child. So for 4 years, families knew there's a treatment that can cure my child, but I can't get access to it because there is not a trial. 2019, following intense pressure from Dr. Cohen and UCLA, the IP was given back to him, back to UCLA. And it's easy to think, yay, success story, right? He's got it back. He's going to be treating patients. But the truth is, at this point, it's not really research, right? When you've treated 70 children and you have a 100% response rate, 96% what we would call a cure, there's no research question to be answered here anymore. Mm-hmm. And so the problem is that you're not going to be able to receive grant funding from NIH or the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine or Texas CPRIT because there's no research questions. Like, you already know the answer. This stuff works. Okay. Similarly, though, you're not going to be able to bill insurance. It's not an approved product. And the amount of money required to file a BLA is enormous, right? So UCLA cannot take that on. That's why they hand it off to a company to begin with. I'm going to build on this story a little bit later because I know we're going to talk about innovative approaches. But Dr. Cohen and his team have been really, I think, innovative in how they're going to take next steps. And so he has been working, he has been treating patients, but it's not a sustainable thing. And those of us who work in institutional academic medicine, we call the status of his product currently a perpetual IND, right? He's not going to be able to market it. He knows it works. He knows he wants to give it to patients, and yet he's treating them on this perpetual product that's not in an approved status. So the perpetual IND thing is a big problem, and it's especially a big problem in pediatric indications when you cannot find a company to take it to market. The other example I want to give is the discussion of CD22. So when CD19 CAR T cells got approved, again, that it was miraculous. We all know the stories. We all love the product. But then we started to see breakthrough, recurrence, relapse, patients who lost their response, right? So in response to that, an academic medical center developed CD22. They handed it off to a company. The company pursued adult indications for all of the financial reasons that we've talked about before. They did not pursue it in children, even though there was significant safety and efficacy data from the academic medical center about pediatric patients. And to this day, that's still the case. To this day, the product is still being studied in adults and not in children. Right. So you have here two stories that really say we just can do better, and we have to change the modeling a little bit to get these products to pediatric patients.
Thank you for those two stories, and I know we will get to even more in depth in them when we get to the innovation part of our discussion. For now, when it comes to rare pediatric diseases, patient numbers are often too low to meet traditional clinical trial thresholds. So what would you say are the alternative trial designs or regulatory strategies that might enable more cell and gene therapy products to reach children without sacrificing rigor?
I think this is an interesting question, and it's one that I've thought about a lot, because I've met Theodore Ernoff twice now, and he is just a fascinating force of nature. I mean, he really is.
Agreed.
The biggest advocate for his patients. And when you talk to him, it's so obvious that we have the ability to really get in there and treat these ultra rare diseases and what we call N of 1 diseases, right? And whether it's an N of 1 or 5 or 10 or even 50, you and I both know that there's no statistical model that's going to get you to what would currently hit the bar of being an approved BLA, right? Mm-hmm. So the problem is, how do we get past that? And I think one thing is people push very hard on regulatory harmonization. I don't know what they mean by that term, but to me, that would mean that the FDA regulations look like the UK regulations, look like Australian regulations. And I have to tell you, I don't see any possibility of that ever happening. There's just no way. You can't even get, I mean, you can look at the political climate right now and just say, okay, on any number of issues, we can't reach any sort of harmony about what it should look like. How in the world are we going to say that products should be there?
Sure.
That being said, I do feel that we should be pushing on something that I call regulatory reliance. Some of my colleagues call it regulatory work sharing. But what it would mean is increased acceptance of other regulatory determinations. So right now you see companies say, oh, I got an orphan drug designation from the US and I got a prime designation from the EU. And, they'll go through their litany of all the things they want. You and I both know that behind all of those things, all of those designations, are thousands, if not millions of dollars being spent on the product, because it's like, oh, we got it here, we got it there, we got it here, right? But also a lot of those are not being, they're not saying, okay, we can actually look at patients across just different jurisdictions and make a determination. When we talk about rare diseases, we have to be able to do that because, going back to the Don Cohn case, in theory, the patients can travel to California to receive the product, but in reality, if they've already got their first infection, that's definitely not going to be in their best interest, right? And when you talk about other, metabolic disorders that some of these children are born with, all of these, with really bad, very rapidly fatal outcomes, it's not feasible to say, well, all of the children or all of the, all of the babies need to be brought to this one site in this one part of the world so that we can count the numbers so that we can say this. We have to get past that, and we have to be able to move these protocols or these treatments across different jurisdictions, be able to look at the data together, and be able to actually accept each other's data and say, okay, there's no reason that a determination made by a regulator in the EU shouldn't be acceptable as a determination that the US would accept as acceptable, right? So I think that that's an important thing. But the other thing is, and there's been real progress in the US on this platform development, right? The use of platforms as an approval process. And so the biggest example we have is the AAV backbone, where literally you have your AAV backbone that remains unchanged, and you basically put in the gene that you want to correct. And when you have different diseases, you put in a different gene. The FDA put out 2 guidances about this last year. They've actually approved their first IND that uses a platform. So I think that there's some real promise here to move this forward as a way of saying, this product, regardless of what disease you're targeting, it's the same product across all. So what I think this will do is definitely for the companies, it will decrease the amount of farm tox studies that are required, right? Because if you're using the same platform and you say, well, we've already proven that this platform is safe, right? Maybe you do some farm tox to prove that your gene replaces the gene that it needs to replace. But basically, you've done your farm tox. The CMC would remain identical. And so you wouldn't be repeating the IND for every different, platform that says the CMC just because we changed this gene. And obviously, there'd still be review of the protocols. But I think that this platform designation, especially in gene therapy, has a potential to change the paradigm of what we look at for rare diseases, because then you are able to maximize not only the money spent on development, but also presumably at the BLA stage, which we haven't gotten there. But if we get a product that could be approved as a BLA as a platform, then you can see where this could really start to snowball into real savings of how much it costs to develop these products. I just want to circle back to say that the one thing I really appreciate is I feel like the FDA has really tried to meet us where we are.
Mm-hmm.
I think that I've been in this field 30 years, so I've been here a long time from when we were really being viewed as in the same way that small molecules are, to when we started being split out and recognized as it's not really a small molecule, to this, which is really saying not only are you not a small molecule, your model is completely different. And so
For sure. Yeah.
I think that all of these show a maturation of regulatory reviews that's really remarkable. So I want to give all of the regulatory agencies some credit for the innovative approaches that they're taking to try and meet us where we are with, our science is not, you put this chemical with this chemical with this chemical and out pops this pill, right? There's so much nuance in this. They recognize it, and they're trying to help bridge that gap between what's safe and what's possible with this. And one thing that I do want to say that I didn't say is that as we talk about different designs, as we talk about different approaches, we as a society are going to have to accept different risk profiles, because there is a real risk when you say, I have this platform, I changed this gene, I expect this outcome. You don't know though, right? And when you're talking, and so you're really going to be looking at serial first in humans in that type of use, right? And so there's going to be an inherent risk that's not really there when you've treated 5,000 patients and saying, well, this is the safety data across 5,000 patients. You're going to be going into a lot of patients where you're like, well, what we have is safety data from 50 patients who all had different diagnoses, or most of them had this diagnosis, but whatever. But every time you go into a new gene, you're going to be doing a first in human, and that is a change in risk. And so I think that part of this has got to be a societal acceptance that we won't have the same level of comfort that we know exactly what's going to happen when we treat different patients.
Absolutely. It's its own animal for sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. I want to talk a little bit about private public partnerships. And I'll get to my question in a second. I suspect that this has, improved over, say, the last 5 years or so. But I would like to hear your take on how public funding agencies, academic institutions such as yours, private biotech companies, what have you, work together to more effectively develop and sustain cell and gene therapy programs for ultra rare pediatric conditions.
Yeah, so I want to start by saying that a lot of what I'm going to talk about is from a paper that was published in Nature Medicine. First author is Crystal Mackel and last author is Don Cohn. So obviously we're going to talk about something there. It was published in January 2025, and it's about enhancing pediatric access to cell and gene therapy products. Notable in the people that I just mentioned, and also notable if you see the whole list of authors, and of course myself, we're all in academic medicine. Why is that? Because primary development of cell and gene therapies is coming from academia. The primary problem is, as we talked about with the Don Cohn story and the CD22 story, is academia can't take these products to market. We're not equipped to take products to market. That's not how we're designed. There have been some changes in the past 5 years, but what I would say is that what we're seeing is sort of a loss of interest or a loss of momentum in funding of cell and gene therapy products overall. And when you take that into pediatrics, where there was already, as we've discussed, not possibly as much interest to begin with, that's a real problem. And so this issue of money is a big issue for all of us in this field. So I finished Don Cohn's story with his perpetual IND and him finding ways to continue to provide the products. In late 2024, in January of this year, he received money from the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, which I'm hoping most of your listeners are familiar with, but it's a funding agency from the state of California. And he received $14.7 million, which, you know, when you talk about drug companies, is not much, but for those of us in academia, this is like, we're rich. So he struck it rich. And he worked with his colleagues to found something that he calls, he calls it a public benefit corporation. And it's a combination of a for-profit and a non-for-profit organization. And the mission statement is that it has to have a public benefit. And when he discusses the plan is to take products to market and to take some of the profits from that and turn it back into a public benefit. In other words, in this setting, I would anticipate that what he's saying is they're going to use the money to fund other research, to take other products to market. And this will be a perpetual loop of, you know, taking these products forward. In the paper that I talked about, they call this a Pediatric Advanced Medicine Biotech, or a PAMB. And they use that PAMB all the way through the paper, which is why I spelled it out for you guys, because I kept thinking, what is that thing? But in any event, that is the same concept. The concept is that the PAMB works with multiple, if not all, that would be the preference of the academic medical centers doing pediatric cell and gene therapy work. They look at the data from those studies. They pick out the ones that look promising, that look like this might actually make a difference for patients. And they take those products and they put them into a separate entity, this PAMB. And the PAMB is going to build on the information they already have about manufacturing and the clinical data, but actually develop, hopefully, multi-site studies that would be done specifically right now throughout the U.S., to take this product through to approval. And I think the one thing that I do want to point out here is that when you look at the model they describe in this paper, it does include going back to the academic medical institutions to continue with the manufacturing within the academic institutions. That is a big difference from what has traditionally happened when you talk about a product that an academic medical center develops and gets either spun off into a new company or gets handed over to a biotech pharma company to take forward. Traditionally, the first thing those companies do is move the manufacturing out of the academic medical institution and into a CDMO. I would call that, I consider that the riskiest part of the whole transition, the tech transfer, because the institutions They include the scientist who had the idea, his team. Obviously, there's a lot of training and expertise that's going on there. Some of that, when you're talking about cells and you're talking about, live products, it just doesn't translate well to moving over to this company where they have turnover and they have all these people coming and going and,
Right.
Whatever. And so there's a real question, I think, about the products that have left academic medicine but didn't pan out in the trials. Were they the same products? Is it really the same product that failed the trial? Or is it, in fact, that the product is no longer the same and that's why it doesn't work? And the other thing I'll say is that during that transition process to more standard drug development pathways, a lot of the clinical trials I've seen these companies develop are the type of clinical trial that you would see with a small molecule. That cannot continue to be the case. These products are not small molecules. The patient populations are not going to fit into that model. It has to be products. It has to be clinical trial specialists developing protocols that would actually work for these products. And I think some of this, to tell you the truth, Erin, is just the growth pattern, right? Literally, this field is so young, and finding people with expertise outside of academia is so difficult. That I think that we're really just now getting to the point where maybe there are statisticians who exist who have been in academia, who know how these clinical trials are developed, who are willing to move out there into companies and say, well, let me help you think about this a different way. But that's part of the problem that's happening here, is just that I think that there's not been a good transition. So I hope that the Public Benefit Corporation, or the PAMB, is a method that will help really move these products forward and serve as a different way of getting them out of academia and across the finish line.
Sure. And that makes a lot of sense. I know that, I would agree with you that even in my experience with working with, like I said before, subject matter experts, the tech transfer, as you mentioned before, hands down, riskiest part of the entire process for all the reasons you mentioned. And because, there's just entirely too much riding on it. And then when you partner with, and albeit, some of the best CDMOs in the world, it still is a very, very risky process. So full agreement here on our side for sure. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about orphan drug policy and the evolution of it. From your perspective, do current orphan drug incentives go far enough to support sustainable development of pediatric cell and gene therapies? Tell us the why or why not, and if not, what are the specific policy reforms that you feel would make a meaningful impact?
So the short answer is yes. I think that actually, again, the problems here aren't regulatory in nature. The FDA, and basically in one form or another, most of the regulatory agencies worldwide have orphan drug designations. They have accelerated approvals for products that show promise or would make a major impact in diseases. I feel like, and again, I'm not negative about the FDA. I'm actually very positive about the FDA and their impact on our field and where we are. I feel like when you talk to the FDA, they try to guide us. They try to provide support for us. And I see this across the area of cell and gene therapy in CBER and the FDA. But I think that there's other things in existence that help push things forward, different acts, different incentives for drug companies to take products forward, different requirements, such as the Research to Accelerate Cures and Equity, which is RACE, which requires adult oncology therapeutics that could also benefit children be developed in children. So this is an actual mandate from the FDA that you must do this if you're a company. Mm-hmm. But the biggest thing, and I'm sure that you've heard about it a lot on your podcast, is the pediatric disease voucher, right?
Sure.
Which is Don Cohen got one of those. I was going to tell you all the processes he had in place, but basically he had orphan drug designation, he had a pediatric disease voucher, and he had breakthrough therapy status. So his product was definitely, even in the beginning, known as being like a life-changing, disease-altering treatment.
Certainly.
These vouchers are usually sold And from that, you can get in the neighborhood of $150 million. So it's a big thing for a company to get one of these vouchers because it's like money in the bank, right? So the problem right now is that the program expired in December of 2024. It hasn't been renewed. What that means is that it's currently, until it gets renewed, the process expires in September of 2026, after which these vouchers don't mean anything. So we need that to be renewed. And that would be kind of the biggest thing I would say. But again, I don't think that it's a regulatory hurdle that's holding us back. I think that it's really interest of companies, and that's where we have to get innovative about how we're going to approach that and get things across the finish line.
Fair. Finally, before we wrap up, I want to talk about certainly what is arguably one of my favorite, most endearing, what I find to be most endearing part of the entire cell and gene therapy, the life cycle of a product. And that is, how patient advocacy is impacted. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about patient advocacy and approval pathways. So in your experience, talk to us a little bit about how patient and caregiver advocacy can better influence the regulatory decisions and access pathways for cell and gene therapy products in small, underserved populations.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. I had the privilege of being invited to DC in May to meet with RFK Jr., Dr. Macquarie, Dr. Prasad, Dr. Oz was there, and RFK Jr. was there, and there were 23 people in the room, including Crystal Mackle, Don Cohen, Kath Ballard, like really the superstars of cell and gene therapy and academic medicine for children. They were in the room, and we were talking about cell and gene therapy. RFK Jr. was very, very positive about cell and gene therapy and the state of where we are. But I think the thing that touched me the most was that one of the participants was a physician who is working in the area of Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, who also has 2 children with Duchenne's muscular dystrophy.
Okay.
And when they got to her, most of the people were like increased access, accelerated approvals, figure out a way to pay for this. All of this is absolutely positively true. But I thought her message just really, really brought it home. She said, in this room, we've talked about cures. We've talked about the miracles that can happen with this. We've talked about, obviously, Dr. Cohen's work. But sometimes it's not the miracle that makes the difference. And her example was that in Duchenne's, there isn't currently a miracle. There isn't currently a treatment that's like, you no longer have Duchenne's. She said, right. And please don't hold approvals for that. Incremental approvals and quality of life can make all the difference. And she pointed to the ability to sit up in a chair and type on a computer and the ability to be in a wheelchair as 2 things that will impact her children's lives. Because she said once they lose that, they lose their ability to interact with the world and communicate with the world.
Right.
And I think that that's such a powerful message for all of us to keep in mind when we talk about these things, is that let's not throw out those potential things that impact people's quality of life, searching for the ultimate goal, right?
Right.
And I think that, aside from what she said, this isn't the first time that the Duchenne's voice has been loud and clear on quality of life issues and suitable endpoints. The organization has a somewhat long history. Even I know, and I don't work in the field, that they have a long history of interacting not only with the public, but also directly with the FDA, where they go to advisory board meetings and they talk about what matters to them. So that is a big piece of how patient advocacy can really make a difference. The ability to make your voice heard about what really matters to your group and your patients is such a huge thing. Sure. And otherwise leaving it to those of us who treat and what we want for our patients and the outcomes we want, that might be great. And, we all want the cure, but if you're living with this, you want the thing that just keeps it going for you and your child, right?
Yeah, and that firsthand feedback is incredibly important. Even, the people developing the cures, developing the therapies, excuse me, and, working on it each and every day, that firsthand experience, firsthand feedback is incredibly important. And, you know, I think as, leaders in the space, you have to be sensitive to that information and knowing, to your point, like, these people aren't, a cure would be wonderful, but, just incremental progress is life changing for them.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
So the second thing I think we can talk about is increased access through decreasing the cost of manufacture and the cost of delivery.
mhm.
And there's going to be people who disagree with me on this, but the removal of the REMS within the last month by the FDA, that is going to decrease the cost of delivery. There's no doubt that there's a lot of administrative burden around the REMS that came out with a lot of the CAR T cell products. And I think that was a good step forward. And, I understand why we needed it to begin with. I absolutely do. But at some point you have to say, well, it's been out here a while and, hopefully people understand what these things are. There's still black box warning. There's still guidance in the package inserts, right? But there's no longer these risk evaluation mitigation strategies that each product had a slightly different one, which definitely increased the complexity of providing these treatments within hospitals and institutions. But back to my first part here, the cost of goods, the cost of manufacture. I'm going to circle back to this multiple times. This is all a matter of money. How much can we provide to support different mechanisms of manufacturing these products, distributing these products, maybe doing point of care where the products are made locally, whether that's in West Texas. And I mean, the logistical issues I talked about, all of that would be mitigated if we could safely provide the products in a hospital that is closer to the patient, right?
Sure.
So I know these are a little bit pie in the sky, but that's what we need to be doing now, right? We need to be like, okay, we know we can do, gene replacement for N of 1 diseases, but how do we actually get it to patients? And right now we're just talking about West Texas versus Houston. We also need to talk about sickle cell disease in Africa. We also need to talk about, all kinds of things that talk about access for children worldwide. So there's a lot to talk about there. And so funding of different mechanisms for this is incredibly important. The third thing I want to talk about, and I want to quote this, so I don't want to actually not have my piece of paper in hand, is that within the last month and possibly within the last week, in Texas, something called HB 3057 was just recently approved. And I got a lot of pushback from my colleagues in other states about how this is bad and, et cetera, et cetera. And yes, I can see where there might be ways that this could be misused. But the bill mandates that health benefit plans in Texas provide coverage for chimeric antigen receptor cell therapy. It applies to a wide range of health insurance providers, including insurance companies, hospital service corporations, HMOs, and self-funded healthcare plans. That's incredible. The part that I also want to push on is that the bill specifically excludes Medicaid programs and children's health plan programs from these requirements. So you can see the carve out that's going to impact a significant number of children in this state, right? Still, it's a good first step. I'm aware of the complexity of this type of bill and how it might play out, but I'm just going to say that the public support for this type of thing, where we actually literally get in there and say, what do we need to do to make this work? It's incredibly important. And advocate groups are and should be very involved in lawmaking. And then my final thing is actually just circling back to funding. The California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, the Texas CPRIT programs, even NIH funding. But also funding from organizations. I mean, the Duchenne Muscular Dystrophy Foundation is an enormous funding source, right? There's just huge private organizations out there that are providing this type of funding that pushes this type of research forward, and their impact is so noticeable. So that's another way that patient advocates really make a difference. But again, there is a place at the table on these advisory boards. So I hope that people will do that.
All right, that wraps up this special series episode of Cell and Gene, the podcast featuring Bambi Grilley. Bambi, thank you so much for your time and for sharing the valuable expertise, as you always do, with us today. I really appreciate it. It's been a pleasure, as always.
Thank you. I really enjoy this, and I look forward to our next one.
Good. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in. Please be sure to share this episode with your colleagues and subscribe to Cell and Gene, the podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. And we'll talk to you soon.